Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories: Gaza's largest functioning hospital is under siege in an Israeli raid as thousands of displaced Palestinians begin an exodus from Rafah. Our other headlines: the Israeli military targets dozens of Hezbollah sites in Lebanon, with the armed group warning Israel will pay for the death of civilians. And
I'm Giles Gibson in Rome, where farmers are driving their tractors into the heart of the Italian capital in the latest in a wave of protests across Europe.
there have been chaotic scenes inside Gaza's biggest functioning hospital, where Israeli special forces have carried out what they've described as a precise and limited mission. Doctors, patients and civilians at Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis were seen fleeing through darkened corridors filled with dust and smoke. Israel says it has credible intelligence that hostages were being held at this hospital. Meanwhile, in nearby Rafah, thousands of displaced Palestinians continue to flee as Israel steps up strikes ahead of a feared ground assault. Well, the Israeli military says fighter jets have hit dozens of Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. The Lebanese armed group, which supports Hamas, says Israel will pay for the deaths of civilians. Israel launched the attacks after a rocket was fired from Lebanon into Israel on Wednesday. Border skirmishes have been taking place for months, fueling concern about the risk of an all-out confrontation.
We heard two impacts. We heard the sound of two missiles landing. We went outside and saw smoke. Who can respond? Who is asking about us? No one cares about anything. You talk about the United Nations, but Israel is everything. It has the say. May God give strength to the resistance.
Well, let's go to Israel now and talk to our correspondent Sarah Coates in Tel Aviv. Sarah, what's the latest from Israel about these attacks on Lebanon?
Jamie, that front remains extremely active. Just over the last couple of hours, the military said a suspicious target crossed over from Lebanon into Israeli territory. It was not intercepted by any aerial defences, while earlier today a barrage of anti-tank missiles were also shot over from Lebanon. They landed inside Israeli territory in open areas, not causing any damage or injury. In response, the Israeli military struck dozens of Hezbollah targets in southern Lebanon. These included rocket launching positions and other buildings belonging to Hezbollah. Well, the IDF Chief of Staff, Herzi Halevi, he has levelled this warning at Hezbollah. He says the military is preparing for war in the north amid daily attacks, adding, "We're not finishing until residents are returned to their homes in the north." And this is in reference to the some 80,000 people who have been displaced on the Israeli side of the border, Jamie.
And what has the Israeli military said about its operation inside Nasser Hospital?
Well, the military believes, according to credible intelligence, that this is where a number of hostages are being hid, and also the bodies, some of the recently deceased captives. The army says it's operating inside that hospital with special forces conducting what it's calling a precise and limited operation, adding that troops would not forcibly evacuate medics or patients. And this is in direct contrast to what has been heard from doctors, saying that people are being marched out of that facility. Let's take a little listen to what we heard from the IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari a little earlier.
According to intelligence assessments and information we gathered on the ground, over 85% of major medical facilities in Gaza have been used by Hamas for terror operations. Because Hamas terrorists are likely hiding behind injured civilians inside Nasser Hospital right now and appear to have used the hospital to hide our hostages there too, the IDF is conducting a precise and limited operation inside Nasser Hospital.
Jamie, the Army says its intel shows that at least 85% of hospitals and other medical facilities inside Gaza have been used by Hamas for terrorist reasons.
Sarah, thank you for that. Our correspondent Sarah Coates in Israel. Well, let's take you next to Gaza and talk to our correspondent Noor Harazin, who's in Rafah. Noor, what's your take, your information about this Israeli raid at Nasser Hospital?
Well, yes, over the past a few days, a week or so, we have been reporting the Israeli forces besieging the Al-Nasser hospital. There is actually a number of people, patients, people who get injured, hospitalized inside the hospital. There is also hundreds of medical staff and also displaced people who take refuge inside the hospital over the past weeks. And the eyewitnesses there and the journalists also have been reporting about how the Israeli tanks are surrounding the hospital, besieging the hospital, destroying the wall fence of the hospital, the Israeli snipers shooting at people who are moving inside the hospital. And also over the past days, the Israeli army have been asking the people to evacuate. However, at the same time, they are shooting at the people inside the hospital. So the people inside the Al-Nasser hospital felt a little bit confused what they should do, what they should be doing. Until today, the Israeli army gathered a number of people and led them to a safe passage. However, while they were walking from Khan Yunis to Rafah, the Israeli army arrested a number of them, including journalists and medical staff. Now, what is happening inside the Al-Nasser hospital? Several shells actually landed on the hospital, killing one Palestinian patient, injuring 10 others. According to the doctors inside the hospital, they are talking that the Israeli army now stormed into the hospital. This is very similar to the scenario of what happened inside the Al-Shifa hospital 2 months ago.
Noor, just bring us up to date with the latest going on there. In particular, how are civilians coping in Rafah?
Well, civilians here in Rafah reached a point where just they have to face the fact that they have no other option. We have been talking over the past days how there is a number of people that actually evacuated Rafah to Middle Gaza, but those people are the people who are already residents of Middle Gaza and can go back to Middle Gaza. But most of the people who are taking refuge in Rafah are from northern Gaza. We are talking about more than 1.5 million people here in Rafah. So, and these people are actually already facing so many hardships, so many difficulties, even finding a shelter here in Rafah. We saw families living inside partly damaged homes, and this is already very dangerous. We saw 2 and 3 and 4 families squeezed into one classroom inside a school. We saw families setting their tents in the sidewalks and even inside the streets. So yes, it is already a struggle for the people here in Rafah to find shelter, but they do have this home, especially hope, especially after the recent very serious talks between Hamas and Israel about a near ceasefire. Maybe this will somehow bring peace onto the ground here in Gaza.
Noor, thank you for that. Our correspondent Noor Harazin in Rafah. Well, international pressure is mounting on Israel to do more to protect Palestinian civilians. Canada, Australia and New Zealand have all issued a joint statement saying a humanitarian ceasefire is urgently needed in Gaza, and they are gravely concerned about the looming military operation in Rafah. Gideon Levy is an Israeli journalist and distinguished author who's a columnist for the Haaretz newspaper. Gideon, welcome. What do you make of this growing international pressure on Israel to step back its operations in Gaza?
Unfortunately, it's not growing and it's not a pressure because it's only talkings. I mean, the international community knows very well how to change things on the ground when it wants to. after the invasion of Russia into Crimea, the international community knew very well how to put sanctions over Russia, and nobody spoke about pressure. Everyone spoke about concrete actions which were taken, concrete measures. With Israel, the world is paying its lip service, but this is not enough because Israel is experienced enough and knows well enough that it can ignore those hollow condemnations as long as it is only talkings.
Why do you believe the international community is so reluctant to do more?
It's a very complex issue because it has to do with the very special status or position, the way that Israel is perceived by the world. Specifically in this time, I'm not sure how much the world cares about the Palestinians, and I have my thoughts how many countries would like, including Arab countries, would have loved to see Israel crashing Hamas, because Hamas might endanger some Arab regimes. Hamas stands for the Muslim Brotherhood, and I'm not sure that those expressions are really reflecting the real thoughts of many in the West and in the Arab world. And beside this, until now we know that Israel has a special status in the world, and what is forbidden for many countries is allowed for Israel for many years so.
How much support does Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu have outside Israel, inside Israel, within his own party, and even within his own cabinet?
Outside, he is in his lowest point ever. Almost nobody comes here anymore, and nobody will talk to him except of the new president of Argentina, which tells you everything. Inside, Netanyahu is still a strong prime minister. The polls are very bad for him, but as long as he is in office, he is still very influential and very strong within his party, within even Israel's public opinion. They would not re-elect him, most probably, but as long as he is the prime minister, he gets quite support. But above all, the question must be, how many Israelis support the continuance of the war? And the answer to this is very clear. The vast majority of Israelis support continuing this war. And this is what matters.
Gideon, good to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming on the programme. Gideon Levy, the Israeli journalist and author.
Thank you.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. The former general now firmly on track to become president of Southeast Asia's largest country. What does it all mean for the wider region?
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos and unicorn companies. Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The green transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
Well, China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us. And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. Gaza's largest functioning hospital is under siege in an Israeli raid as thousands of displaced Palestinians begin an exodus from Rafah. Our other headlines, the Israeli military targets dozens of Hezbollah sites in Lebanon, with the armed group warning Israel will pay for the deaths of civilians. World leaders and policymakers are heading to Germany for the Munich Security Conference. Now in its 60th year, war and geopolitical tensions remain at the center of debates, and the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza top the agenda. Our correspondent Natalie Carney reports.
Every year, the Bayerischer Hotel provides an intimate setting for senior decision makers and thought leaders to discuss the world's most pressing security issues outside traditional diplomatic channels. Unsurprisingly, Ukraine will again dominate the talks, but a possible change in the White House is raising concerns.
In respect of the fact that Donald Trump could be maybe re-elected in the US, and that there will be a U-turn in the foreign policy of the US towards Ukraine, the European states in the NATO bloc should really think about their own security in terms of that they become more independent from the US.
Donald Trump's threat to encourage Russia to attack NATO members who do not pay their bills just days before the start of the conference has called into question the transatlantic partnership and European security.
Lassen Sie mich aus aktuellem Anlass klar sagen.
Let me clearly say, any reinterpretation or conditionalization of NATO's collective defense guarantee is irresponsible and dangerous, and is only in Russia's interests. Nobody should play or bargain with Europe's security.
The conference will also focus on the conflicts in Gaza and the Horn of Africa, in addition to broader issues like climate security and the impact of new technology. Among the delegates are U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, Israeli President Isaac Herzog, and Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh, along with two high-level delegations from China. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is also expected to outline Kyiv's vision of this decisive year.
Dubbed the Davos for defense, discussions here at the Bayerischer Hotel this year will be dominated by conflict. The conflict in Ukraine, in Gaza, and in Yemen. Yet event organizers have announced that Russia and Iran will not be present at the table.
We have to first set a common ground with material terms in order to bring Russia or Iran to a point where we can negotiate with each other. And then it's possible to negotiate on common terms.
The release of the annual Munich Security Report on Monday speaks of the lose-lose dynamics that are fostered when governments prioritize gains rather than global cooperation. In view of growing geopolitical tensions and rising economic uncertainties, the core mission of the three-day conference, now in its 60th year, to promote peace through dialogue, could not be more pressing. Natalie Carney, CGTN, in Munich.
Thousands of farmers are converging on the centre of the Italian capital, Rome, continuing their protests over EU and Italian agricultural policies. Much of Rome was brought to a standstill last week as tractors blocked streets around some of the best-known landmarks. Well, our correspondent Giles Gibson is watching events for us in Rome. Giles, farmers' protests in Italy gaining momentum over the last few weeks. What do you expect today?
Well, Jamie, the expectation or the estimate from the farmers' groups that have gathered here in the Italian capital was that we would get around about 20,000 farmers coming to the Italian capital to protest. But I can tell you that it looks like they haven't quite managed those sorts of numbers. It's a little bit hard to tell because there have been these protests moving through the city, tractors driving around the city past some iconic spots such as the Colosseum. They've been making their way here to the Circo Massimo, the Circus Maximus, which of course back in the day, back in the ancient Roman times, was where they used to race chariots, and it's now sort of a big park in the middle of the city where you commonly have demonstrations of this kind of thing. In terms of numbers, I mean, looking around, I think there are certainly less than 1,000 people here, certainly not anywhere near the 20,000 people that they were talking about, although that number could rise in the next couple of hours or so. Speaking to the farmers here, you're hearing the same sort of things that you've been hearing from farmers in other parts of Europe. So they're concerned about rising costs, about supermarkets driving down prices, about imports coming in from overseas. Particularly the word you keep hearing is Ukraine. But I spoke to one farmer here and he told me, look, if we want the government to make concessions, if we want to see change, then we've got to get more numbers out for protests such as this one.
Giles, how has the government responded to these protests so far?
Well, ironically, the Meloni government has been seen since it came into power in 2022 as very friendly towards farmers and towards the agricultural sector. They've done sort of things that have been seen as symbolic in terms of putting a ban in place last year on synthetic meat, on laboratory-grown meat, which was seen as a real boon, of course, for the cattle sector, for farmers here in Rome. And they also, in recent weeks, have brought in things like targeted tax breaks, those tax breaks set to last for a couple of years. But I think if they want to get even greater concessions out of the government, then these farmers are going to have to turn up in bigger numbers and cause the sorts of disruption that we've seen in places like France and Belgium and the Netherlands.
Giles, thank you for that. We'll return to you later in the day. Our correspondent, Giles Gibson, in Rome. Preliminary results from Indonesia's presidential election shows former Defence Minister Prabowo Subianto heading for a landslide victory. It'll be some weeks before the official results are released, but if confirmed, Prabowo will take over from President Joko Widodo, who remains hugely popular. Our correspondent Sulkina Ahluwalia reports.
Third time's a charm for Prabowo Subianto. Indonesia's defense minister emerged as the frontrunner in this year's presidential elections. Prabowo is leading with a significant majority in the early results, a moment that could redefine Indonesia's political path. The former army general has vowed to continue President Joko Widodo's legacy. This includes moving the capital city, developing infrastructure, and expanding employment opportunities.
Prabowo also have some concern to improve crops harvest, like maybe rice and cassavas, or maybe other staple food that might be beneficial. And also, I also noticed that Prabowo encouraged the food diversification for most Indonesians. So I think this will be a clue for us that Prabowo committed to the farming industry.
Indonesia's youth played a key role in this election. Half of the nation's 200 million voters were under 40 years old. And many experts say that is the reason why Prabowo secured this win. He embraced a modern campaign strategy, rebranding himself as somewhat of a grandfather figure to the younger generation.
In addition to that, his running mate is President Widodo's son, Gibran Rakabuming Raka. Jokowi, as he is commonly known, is wildly popular. He's called the people's president, having come from humble beginnings.
Yeah, Gibran is one of the things that makes me want to vote for Prabowo. If, I don't know, maybe if Prabowo choose another person, maybe I'm still hesitate, but Gibran is one of the best things that Prabowo bring to this election for me.
The world is watching as Indonesia's economic and geopolitical landscape is shifting. This marks a new chapter for Indonesia, and Prabowo is confident that his presidency will lead the country to greater heights. Sulkina Ahluwalia, CGTN, Jakarta.
The renovated spire of the world-famous Notre Dame Cathedral has been revealed 5 years after the historic Paris landmark was ravaged by fire. Shrouded by scaffolding, since it's been undergoing mass restoration since 2019. Our correspondent Tony Waterman reports.
In 2019, tens of millions of people around the world watched in real time as the 19th century spire atop Notre Dame Cathedral toppled over, engulfed in flames. The structure has been behind barriers ever since, and the parts that are visible have been largely obscured by scaffolding, but that is now starting to be removed. And for the first time, the newly installed spire, which had been hidden behind 70,000 pieces of scaffolding, can be seen. At the top sits a golden rooster and cross, and the bird has flaming wings, which is meant to symbolize a phoenix rising from the ashes. The new spire is a near replica of the one that was destroyed in the fire. Although there was a competition for alternative ideas, which was won by two young Chinese designers. Their theme was Paris Heartbeat, and it would have featured a mirrored roof and spire with a time capsule on top. But ultimately, French officials decided to stick with tradition. The famed cathedral was also recognized during this year's Chinese New Year Gala. Singers from France and China performed Belle from the smash hit musical Notre Dame de Paris, marking the 60th anniversary of Sino-French diplomatic relations. Back here in Paris, the scaffolding will continue to be removed in the coming weeks, providing the first glimpses of what the restored part of the cathedral will look like. And the building itself is slated to reopen on December 8th, but it could take another 40 years before this iconic cathedral is fully restored. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Paris, France.
The mission to put the first private lunar lander on the moon has got off to a successful start when it launched from Florida.
2, 1, ignition, and liftoff.
The lander, nicknamed Odysseus, built by the US-based group Initiative Machines, was carried on board a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket. The mission, which took off from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, hopes to complete the first US moon landing in 52 years. The plan is for the lander to spend 9 days in space before reaching the moon's south pole on the 22nd of February. A bill to legalize same-sex marriage in Greece looks set for approval with a vote due in Parliament. Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis has been pushing the legislation since he was re-elected last June. The law would also allow same-sex couples the right to adopt children, but stop short of letting them access reproductive methods like surrogate pregnancies. The Greek Orthodox Church has been a strong opponent of the bill. The headlines again: Gaza's largest functioning hospital is under siege in an Israeli raid as thousands of displaced Palestinians begin an exodus from Rafah. Our other headlines: the Israeli military targets dozens of Hezbollah sites in Lebanon, with the armed group warning Israel will pay for the deaths of civilians. And that is the world today. Thank you for watching. We're back with more news at the top of the hour. Coming up next, it's World Inside. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.